Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
Hi, I'm Susan, and I'm a college counselor and have read applications for a small liberal arts college and 2 research universities. My twins are recent college graduates.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of 2 daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy is a wellness coach at the Keenan Flagler Business School at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. Friends, one announcement before we start with today's episode. We are 7 days away from Linda Depker and Lisa Ruff, 2 of our co-hosts, doing a presentation, a webinar, 1-hour Q&A for our parents. And it's called Serenity Now, Strategies for Parents to Calm the College Admissions Process. That's Thursday, May 30th, 8:30 Eastern, 7:30 Central, 6:30 Mountain, 5:30 Pacific. Just go to yourcollegeboundkid.com, click the events tab to sign up. This week in the news, Susan and I will discuss a new book by Stephen Burd, who's somewhat of a whistleblower on enrollment management. He's got a new controversial book out, and it's called Lifting the Veil on Enrollment Management, How a Powerful Industry is Limiting Social Mobility in Higher Ed. There's an excellent article out about this book, and Susan and I will have a robust discussion about what I believe is going to be a really important topic. Jill and I will answer a question from a listener from Texas who wants to know how colleges calculate the travel figures they share in their cost of attendance information. How do they come up with that? So I'll be sharing that information as Jill and I discuss that. And for our interview, it'll be part 3 or 4 with our homeschool experts, college counselors Dr. Michele Evard and Holly Ramsey, who have an upcoming book, by the way, coming up on homeschooling, and Liam Dailey, an admission officer at Beloit College, who serves as a homeschool liaison and specialist for homeschool applicants. And we'll be talking about how admission officers evaluate homeschool students. And for our college spotlight, Kevin Newton is back to talk about the London School of Economics, aka LSE. Friends, I am here with Susan, and I'm very excited because we're going to talk about a really important article. How are you, Susan?
I'm good, Mark. Thanks. Good to see you.
Thank you. Always good to see you.
Hear you, I should say. No one else can see you, so I
right,
should
but we
admit
can
to that.
see each other. We see you on video. We're on video.
That's right.
Awesome. So, but before we do, we've been doing these sessions on activities and everything, and we haven't been giving our listeners our traditional admission vernacular, admission tip, and big number. So I've got an admission vernacular and a big number, and Susan's got a tip that I'm excited to talk with you guys about. So the admission vernacular, and this is a good one because Susan and I are going to be talking about a lot of money-related things. It's a term that when I talk to VPs of enrollment, they just roll it off their tongues like they're like the ABCs. They're so used to using it. And it's NTR, and it stands for net tuition revenue. Net tuition revenue. Like, that's not a world that applicants think about, but in the world of enrollment, you have to look at how much money are you bringing in per student to make the books balance, to balance the books. And so I thought it'd be a good one to share today because it's somewhat related to the stuff Susan and I will be talking about. So NTR is our admission vernacular. Susan's got a tip for us. Go ahead, Susan.
I do indeed. This is the time of year we're recording this around May 20th. Hard to believe it's already at that point. And so I'm working with juniors. I have my remote clients that I work with, all over the country and a couple foreign countries. And then I'm also still an interim at a school for this semester while they're searching for a new director. So I've been spending a lot of time with juniors, and I am remembering the tremendous value I find of having juniors at this time of year create their Common App account and start working on a draft. especially before they dive into their essay work, because I think experience with the application gives the kids a chance to see how colleges will see them. So it's a real a paradigm shift from here I am, I'm this person, I'm representing myself, but then they have to, in a way, step back and start to envision how the people who read their application on the college side will actually see them, which is hard. That's hard to do. But the first step when a junior creates a Common App account, commonapp.org, go to the website, click on the create a new account. It's very easy. This is an account in which they will identify themselves as a junior, right? Because they don't want to pretend to be a senior at this point, because then a lot of the features won't work, because a lot of colleges are done. But the first question they're asked as they're creating their new account is whether or not they want to Common App to be allowed to share their contact information with colleges that the junior, lists. So this is the one time where I tell kids always to check the box yes. Usually we've all learned that's a great way to invite a million unrelated emails into your inbox. But what this means is that Common App, then as you populate your Common App list, whether that's now or whether that's after August 1st, when the application rolls over to the version for the class of 2025, it means that as a student populates their list, those colleges somehow are notified. My guess is there's a way that Common App emails those colleges and identifies the students that have entered them in the list. From the college's perspective, this is a really big deal. This is one of those supreme moments of demonstrated interest that even if a college doesn't consider demonstrated interest, this is still a moment that they really appreciate, because the student out of the thousands of colleges in the country has chosen to put them on their Common App list. Now, they know they're only juniors in the spring of the year, but you know what? It's still a step toward the application process, kind of a step down that funnel, as we refer to it, that colleges know. Plus, they then may choose to begin to market to the student in a different and more intentional. And I honestly don't know what the information is. Like, I don't know if they get the name of the high school. They certainly get the address and the email contact. But we should really find out, Mark. Maybe we could ask Hillary.
Yeah.
Whether they get the major.
I first learned this when I was a KIP, and I was talking to a school, and they're like, "What happened to so-and-so? They had us, they'd added our name, and I never heard anything from them."
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's important for people to realize, it's similar for athletic recruiting, right? Like, your time is the most valuable thing you have, and there's so many people out there. And so when a student takes the initiative to reach out, you're like, okay, this may be worth my time to target this person in some way. And that could be invite them to an event we're having in the area, or even a special online session. I mean, there's so many different things you can do, but
that's right.
But I was literally explaining this 2 hours before we recorded this to a student from South Carolina, Susan, about how the admissions funnel works. And I talked about the prospects. Sometimes when you see schools, they literally might have 1 million or 500,000 prospects. But when you look at that funnel, there's usually a big drop off from prospects to inquiries. And inquiries means you took a step. You took some initiative as opposed to a list buy or something. And that could be going on and requesting information on the website. That could be attending a virtual program. It could be doing a visit. It could be stopping by a fair. It could be coming to a session at your school. And it can be doing what Susan's talking about, entering a name, and these things are important. I think sometimes students and parents, especially if they're looking at low admit schools, they feel almost like the deck is so stacked against them. But a lot of times that's how colleges feel. Like there's so many of us
Right.
and there's one of you, like,
That's very true.
Yeah, and people are applying to all these schools and we're up against people with more money and more merit money and better facilities and all the different, things and rankings. And like, it's hard for us. And so when you get someone, you want to move forward. I never forget, I was having a conversation with an admission officer, at a women's college. And she was just telling me how hard it is because, you've seen the studies, 92% of women say they won't even consider a women's college. So
Is that high?
Yes.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And that's what our surveys show too. We asked that question so we have the same percentage. But think about it. You've got half the population's knocked off and then you lose 9 out of 10. And I was talking with one and I was telling an admission officer and I was telling her about like one of the best tips I ever got, in admissions was somebody from actually Vancouver, British Columbia. I met her at San Francisco. And she said, Mark, I never learned this till 20 years in, but I have a big giant map on my wall and I have where all of our families are from and I have pins, all over. And then I go back and I look at each one and I look at who the influences are and I see if they'll be willing to host in-home receptions for us and invite all their friends. And it's been incredibly positive. So I was sharing this and then the rep says, well, we do more than that. We try to meet every single person who's taken a step toward us at a Starbucks or something over a coffee when we're on the road. Like that's how valuable this interest is. And we have to see if we can move you along that admissions funnel, of course, from prospect to inquiry to applicant, hopefully applicant to admitted applicant to deposited, and then hope you don't melt over the summer and you show up in the fall, right? So
that's right.
The whole sequence there. You don't get plucked off the wait list by somebody or something. So yeah, and so I'm glad you shared that because I don't think that I remember us mentioning this once in passing and we've never talked even 3 to 4 minutes about it.
Well, and it's just one of those things, Mark, where, at the juniors often they just are spinning their wheels. They, we tell them about the value of getting on college campuses, of taking these steps toward building a record of engagement with colleges, doing the research, developing a list of research questions and figuring out what their values are and how they, kind of align with the values of the college. But the juniors can get really swamped in that. And I have found, I found this as a parent too, when my kids were at that age, that breaking it down and giving them a kind of a mixture of concrete tasks to accomplish, that just help them feel, I do have some control. I can do this. I can affect this. It's not all, this random ball bouncing around that I have no control over. And then, ease them into the deeper questions. But when you're talking about, kind of left side of the page, the concrete steps that anybody can take to begin having some agency in the process. And then the right side of the page, the larger questions that are going to take time and some pretty deep research and conversation to develop an understanding of. And it's just so important to do that. And college admissions people know this too. They know how to engage with teenagers around things that are concrete and motivational because they let the student feel like they've got some control. And then, then an admissions person can work on the sell a little harder on the other side. But it's just kind of a good principle of sales. I mean, that you were,
Sure.
You were in sales. I was in admissions.
Right.
And it does all line up. And I mean, the article that we're going to be talking about has, brought back a lot of those memories.
Sure.
For me. We even used to differentiate back in, when I was at Bates in the 80s and the early 90s. And we'll talk about this more later, but the difference between a warm and a cold prospect.
Sure.
And we'll use that as a teaser because we'll
Yeah,
talk more about
sure.
that.
Yeah, and I don't want listeners to think, oh, by going in and having your kid add a college in the Common App that all of a sudden your chances of admission went way up. It's more a matter of it can lead to some intentionality
Right.
of the school possibly reaching out to you. And the reaching out to you may be a targeted mailing campaign that is done only for inquiries and not for prospects. That sort of thing frequently happens because it's a pretty clear sign that there's some interest, because that's something you really proactively had to do. And
Right.
and I don't know if the sequence in the algorithm that I use to buy my list of names is actually in fact targeting the right people. I'm guessing. But when you do something as proactive as that, it reminds me of a conversation I had just at SACAC this March when we were in Raleigh, Susan, and I was talking with the VP of Enrollment, and he said, boy, was I ever sad when FAFSA took away our ability to see the rankings. Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in the past, listeners, if you're not following this, in the past, and this is up until recently, you could only list 10 schools on the FAFSA. You'd have to go back in and add more. But colleges could see the order. And this VP of Enrollment was telling me that we targeted, if you were 1, 2, or 3, that was a telltale sign we're on your mind at the top. And we micro-targeted that, and boy, did we ever lose a tool in our toolkit. Well, word got out that colleges were using the order to deprioritize kids and
Yes.
waitlist or not admit kids that had them lower, no matter how strong they were, because they took it as a sign they weren't coming. And so that stuff got squashed. Would that have been a decade ago? It's so hard after the
No,
while.
it was only a couple of years.
Boy, Susan, it's like
It wasn't very
less
long
than
at all.
10 years ago, wasn't it? Maybe 5? Who knows?
Yeah, that's what I'd say.
The years go by so fast now. I have no sense of
I
perspective.
know.
I really don't.
We have to think about where were we, who were we working with at that time.
Well, that's
But,
one thing that's good about West Town, because I know
Yeah.
I've left 15 years ago, so I can always. It's almost like BCAD. So like even when I'm talking with you about a kid, like I'll remember. That was about 3 years before I moved from Philly to Atlanta, 18 years ago.
That's so funny. That's so
Yeah,
funny.
yeah.
Well, but I think the whole FAFSA thing, I think that was pretty shady because that was not meant to be used for that purpose. And there were families that listed colleges alphabetically. There were families that listed them in lots of different ways. And it was a blindside in my mind of using data for something for which it was not intended. Now, I get it.
Yeah, I get both sides.
I get it.
If I was voting to change it, I would have voted to change it for the reason that you said.
Yeah.
But if I was on the other side, I would absolutely have used it if my research indicated I had higher yield rates with the top 3. That's too valuable for me to not use.
But to me, because it was a use of a data point for something for which it wasn't intended. I mean, I can see, yes, you'll favor the student that comes to see you at a school visit, or who visits your campus, or who puts you in the Common App list, because those are kind of aligned with the purpose. Whereas the FAFSA, first of all, the kid isn't even filling it out, that part of the application. Chances are the parents are putting in the college list, and who knows what they're thinking of at that moment.
There's definitely lots
time.
of opportunity for misreads. No question about that with that data. I'm just being honest. It is so competitive out there for admission offices that if you have a tool in your toolkit that helps you with yield, you're going to use it. I know I did.
I understand colleges, I feel the same way about standardized test scores, that what little value there is in a data point, when it's grossly outweighed by the damage and misunderstandings that are caused by that data point, then it doesn't matter what the positive value is. That
Yeah.
But that's how I feel about the FAFSA list.
Sure.
too.
No. And I get it. I mean, you feel a little stronger than I do on the testing, but I'm pretty close to you. Like, I think that that's the single biggest part. I was talking to somebody who I'm working with, who listens to the podcast, and the subject of testing came up, and the student has good testing, but the dad said, "Yeah, I listen to podcasts. I know you don't like standardized testing," and I was like, "Wait a minute, let's let me properly describe my position. And
Yeah.
it's not, I wouldn't say I don't like standardized testing. What I would say is I don't trust most people to be able to put it in context. I don't trust most people's ability to put it in context. And if you actually even listen to the Yale podcast when they did their big rollout of their sort of, hybrid view, if you want to call it that they went with, in part 3, they actually said that. They actually said one of the dangers of numbers is they bias the mind, and there can be a real tendency to put more weight on them than they deserve. And I think we've just seen it so much, haven't we, Susan? Like as soon as you see a number, you see, let's say you're a school and you normally take kids with 1440s and you see a 1310 and immediately you have a bias when that kid could not only excel in your program, but add so much. But, numbers do voodoo on the brain.
Right.
So,
well, and then they have to compensate. One of the admissions people at Yale that I've admired over the years was doing a presentation. This was quite a while ago, probably 15 years ago at a conference, maybe a little more. And she said the first thing we look at are the test scores. This was way before the pandemic. And of course, all the guidance counselors in the room were horrified, and there was this audible gasp. And she said the reason is because if we really want to admit a student, we have to find compensatory information so that we can present the full picture in favor of that student. And I thought that was interesting. And
I don't know
the
if
fact
I buy
that
it.
I remember it, the fact that I remember it now, because in all of my admissions positions, we've looked at the test scores either in the middle or at the end of the process. So there has already been a very large impression, particularly of the student's high school academic record, that is already established before we look at the scores.
I found it really hard to just completely block, like to not have scores bias you, even when you tried not to. But anyway, let's get off this topic, Susan. We'll be on here all day.
It's the one thing that I will give College Board credit for, though, since I have started
Landscape?
reading applications using the landscape.
That helps
It's
a lot.
easier for everybody not to make that immediate assumption. It really is. It completely changes.
No, landscape is, if you're trained to use it and trained well, and landscape is definitely and there are a lot of schools that absolutely use landscape to put it in context. No question. All right, Susan, I know if we get on the test score subject.
I know. Well, let me conclude the Common App college list advice with just one word. The good news is that you can take a college out anytime you want.
Yes.
Because I don't want families to think, well, gee, that's, I get 20 spaces and then I have to apply.
Sure.
Or are they going to know that, I'm just toying with them? It's like, okay, that doesn't really matter. You can, if you want to see what a college's supplementary essays are, you've got to put them in your Common App and take a look and see what pops up. Especially, right now it's the information for the seniors, but it's going to give you a pretty good idea. There are going to be some changes this year. We know that's coming in some of the supplements, but August 1st, you'll know, but at least you can say, well, here's what this college had applicants write about this past year.
Absolutely. And I have a big number, and I want to preface this. So a lot of times, students and parents, they're surprised, like, how did my kid not get in? They had a 3.93 or GPA. And what I want to talk about is grade inflation. So I was looking at a school profile for a student I'm working with at a Northeastern school, and they did a grade distribution on the profile. So these were the numbers, Susan. 7% had A pluses, 42% had A's, A averages.
Yikes.
32% had A minuses. So if you do the math, that's 81% of the kids had an A minus, and 12% had B pluses. So 93% of the kids had a B plus or higher, 81% had an A minus or higher. And so if you're just in your own world, which most people are, you're not seeing access to all these other grades out there, you might think, well, I think a 3.85 is super high, but from a college's standpoint, and by the way, it may be high depending on the grading, and this is very contextual, like all schools are different, but that's the kind of thing that schools are seeing. A C of A pluses, A's, A minus. I mean, here's a school that's got 93% of kids with B pluses and 81% A minus or higher averages. Which, by the way, not to get back on there, but that is one of the things that ends up making people look more to things like scores when they feel like if I'm staring at a sea of A's. But I know that that's lazy admissions, and we'll leave it at that. But anyway, so 93% B plus, 81% A's. This is a school A minus or higher. Not going to mention the school, but it's a household name that a lot of people will have heard of. So that's one thing that's out there, and that's one reason why you shouldn't be surprised if you have a high GPA and you're not admitted, because you're not the only one with a high GPA. It's just a lot of grade inflation. Don't mean to sound so dour, but thought people might find that interesting.
Yeah.
And now it's time for Hot Topics in the News.
Let's transition. So this is such an important article that I'm going to read it. And I always hesitate when I do that because I don't want to bore people. But I think it is that important. And I think by you hearing the article, you'll really understand the conversation Susan and I are going to have. So it's called Pulling Back the Veil on Enrollment Management. And some places I'll summarize it. So Stephen Burd, he's got a new book out. And he blames much of higher ed's current woes on the multi-million-dollar industry of enrollment management. And so what he did here is he spoke to Inside Higher Ed about how admissions became a numbers game and why poor students are worse off for it. And so it's an article from Liam Knox in Inside Higher Ed. Once again, the book called Lifting the Veil on Enrollment Management, subtitled How a Powerful Industry is Limiting Social Mobility in America's Higher Education. I've always enjoyed Stephen Burd and his writings. So, but this is a very controversial perspective he has. So I'm going to read it and Susan and I can discuss it. So it says, Stephen Bird's new book charts the rise of enrollment management and its role in higher ed's affordability crisis. Comb through the administrative ranks of any major university, and chances are you're going to see a job title containing the words enrollment management, usually attached to vice president, vice provost, or director. But the term itself, which describes the intertwining of revenue and recruitment goals with admissions and financial aid strategy, is relatively new. It was invented in the 1980s and it became widespread in the 2000s. Around the same time, a cottage industry of educational consulting firms transformed into a multi-billion-dollar market and made enrollment management an organizing principle of higher ed. Now, Stephen Burd, he's a senior writer and an editor of New America, think tank New America. Our longtime listeners may remember we featured some of his research that he did, and he paired up with You Aspire to do a study of financial aid awards and the misleading language. So we featured him. That was probably 3 or 4 years ago on here. So anyway, Burd believes that enrollment management is destroying higher ed. And he lays out that argument in his book, Lifting the Veil on Enrollment Management, How a Powerful Industry is Limiting Social Mobility in American Education. It's produced by Harvard Press. And the book is a collection of essays. So he's got writers, critics of higher ed, and some journalists like Neil Swidley and John Marcus, who you may remember. We featured him at least 7 or 8 times from the Hechinger Report on our podcast here. And what they do is they chronicle the sector's rapid ascension and subsequent marketization. And the early enrollment management guru Don Hostler also offers his repentant tale of reckoning with the outcomes. So as you read this collection of essays, the story that emerges is the gradual takeover of college admissions by what oftentimes are referred to as the quants, or quantitative analysts, and the corporate suits of the Reagan era, who transformed an outdated but humanistic field, talking about admissions, into a pure, cold numbers game. Burd, this is a long list here. You got to listen to this. Burd blames enrollment management for a litany of higher ed woes, including the student debt crisis, skyrocketing sticker prices, diminishing financial aid for needy students, outsized influence of the rankings, and small college closures. His list of grievances goes on and may, to a casual observer, seem overblown, but he insists that his thesis is not hyperbolic. My goal with this book is to raise awareness of the industry that's done so much harm, he said. They've operated in the shadows for so long, and now it's time to lift the veil. And so basically what I'm going to read to you is a series of questions and answers. So first question, because it's an interview with Inside Higher Ed, Liam Knox. Question, can you tell me in a few words what is enrollment management? Answer, it is essentially the practice of taking a management and marketing approach to college admissions and breaking down the firewalls between the financial aid office, the admission office, the development office, and recruitment. Question, how exactly has this made college less affordable? Answer, the student is treated as a customer, particularly the ones colleges are trying to attract. The best applicants are the wealthiest applicants. As a result, colleges compete fiercely with each other for the most desirable students, meaning the wealthiest students, creating a fierce arm race in which colleges try to outmaneuver and outcompete each other by providing better merit scholarships. It also leads to more investment in amenities and experiences. There's a real catering to wealthy students, and that makes everything more expensive and leads the colleges to become more exclusive and expensive. Meanwhile, low-income students are left with fewer seats and larger funding gaps that require them and their parents to take out substantial debt. Question, how did we get here? What happened to make this the guiding principle in college admissions and enrollment planning? Answer, before, we had the more traditional college admissions office, where there were guardrails between admissions and financial aid, between the development office, and colleges were at least attempting to use their financial aid to meet needs. There was a huge change in the late 70s and the early 80s. It all started at Boston College, which in the 70s was losing lots of students, struggling with terrible economic inflation. And Jack McGuire, a scientist, very much an outsider, he comes in to run Boston College's admissions office. And he looks at how they're giving out financial aid, and he thinks, this doesn't make any sense. He's the one who coined the term enrollment management. And one of the things I liked about Salingo's book, Who Gets In and Why, he really goes into depth on Jack McGuire and the role he's played in enrollment management and shaping college admissions. Anyway, the article, this goes on to say, he's the first one who coins the term enrollment management, which at first is about breaking down the walls between offices and having all these different units working together to achieve two goals, raising revenue and raising prestige. Suddenly, there are all these directors of enrollment management at campuses, and that's what I focused on in the beginning of the book. But what I came to see was that there's an entire industry, a very lucrative industry, that has played a pivotal role in making higher ed less affordable and less accessible for low-income students and middle-income students. Those firms are really what I'm focused on in the book, and their influence, which has only grown with time. Question, a lot of enrollment management seems on the surface level to be about using data to optimize classes and budgets. But you talk about how there's something more sinister going on. When did that transition occur? Answer, well, at first it really was about the quants, just looking at the numbers and finding a better way to make everything run. But it really became about capitalism coming to colleges and completely taking over. That starts to happen in the early 2000s, when the smaller enrollment consulting firms, like McGuire, he left Boston College to start his own in '83, are making a ton of money and they're growing in their valuation. And you have a wave of mergers and acquisitions, some of them nearing the $1 billion range. That's when the big money and the big business really get going. And enrollment management spreads like wildfire because you have college leaders saying, I have to adopt this or I'm going to be at a competitive disadvantage. The enrollment management industry really plays on those insecurities. That's also when the practice starts to get adopted by public universities. The 2008 recession really accelerated that because that's when states started disinvesting, and he's referring to, less of their state coffers, appropriations going toward college funding. And they had to look for other revenue sources, and tuition became more important. Question, how has it changed colleges' philosophy around financial aid? Answer, what financial aid becomes, especially as the consulting firms grow and capitalize on the enrollment management boom, is a strategy to meet institutional revenue goals. One of the most amazing things I've seen is when an EAB, which is one of the largest players in the business, an educational consulting company, executive basically said the purpose of financial aid is to raise revenue for the institution. I've covered financial aid since the early 90s, and I've never heard that definition of financial aid. It's a whole sea change. What they're trying to do is to find the right discount to give, just enough so that the most desirable students choose them. The biggest discounts tend to go to the best applicants, and that means to the wealthiest students. The best applicants help them rise in the rankings. The wealthiest help them increase their revenue. Discounts do go to financial needy students, but it'll never be enough to meet their need. In fact, to put it bluntly, leaving low-income students with large funding gaps is part of the game plan. So these low-income families have little choice if they want to attend these schools than to take out large amounts of debt. Question, Utah enrollment management boom to the rise of U.S. News and World Report rankings, which are taking off at around the same time. How are the two related? Answer, they're pretty much inextricable. At the same time that enrollment managers were saying we should be recruiting and using financial aid and admitting classes according to certain measurable metrics, U.S. News was coming in and defining those metrics. Once that happened, the data nerds who started the movement are kind of disempowered, and the big consulting firms become much more important. Question, you also make the argument that enrollment management has hurt colleges financially more than it's helped them. A conclusion that seems to contradict your explanation of their motivations for adopting it. Can you please explain that? Answer. Originally, the industry was helping small private colleges that were less well endowed to survive in a tough market. The problem with tuition discounting is that the discount rates have gone up so far to stay competitive that the schools were no longer getting enough surplus revenue to invest in other things. And now we're seeing a lot of those smaller private colleges shutting down. There are some exceptions. WashU and St. Louis did really have a big comeback in the 80s and 90s that turned it from a streetcar college, another term for commuter school, to the research powerhouse they are now. Boston College, of course, was a major case study, but those were early adopters. Now that everybody's doing it, you don't get the same results, and it's a net minus. It's especially been bad for public institutions. For generations, they didn't have to worry about their enrollment because they were the reliable getaway to the middle class. Universally low cost, democratizing institutions. They'd been getting more expensive, but once they started to adopt enrollment management strategies and become more like private colleges, it meant hiking up tuitions and recruiting out-of-state students and losing that powerful selling point to some degree. Question, are there any positive applications for enrollment management? And basically, the one positive that he goes on to say is it has helped with retention, which of course is also a revenue issue. But it helped give rise to the student success and support apparatus, which really helped low-income and first-gen students. The flip side is that colleges see the best way to increase their retention rates is to stop enrolling low-income students since they're most likely to stop out. Question, you pin a lot of blame for the state of higher ed on enrollment management. Is it really the apocalyptic force your book makes it out to be? I believe it is. There's a bit of a chicken and egg situation where in the Reagan era, there was so much state disinvestment and enrollment management comes in to fill revenue gaps for institutions. But I put a ton of burden for the student debt crisis on it, for instance, which makes it even crazier that policymakers don't really even address it or even know about it. We've had so many hearings on Capitol Hill about higher ed and affordability and student debt, but never once are they calling up the heads of these firms to explain their algorithms. They really have been able to hide in the shadows. But if we're going to really understand why all these crises are happening in higher ed and address them head on, we need to be able to understand the enrollment management industry. All right. I hope I didn't put people to sleep. I know I read a lot, but I wanted people to understand what we're about to talk about. So, Susan, I understand this is hugely controversial because I know what people will say from the enrollment management side, which is if we don't have money, we'll close or we won't be able to provide the services, whether it's academic counseling or mental health or career services, or pay good teachers. So we need to have money. And so we can't be naive and have our head in the sand. So what are your thoughts? I've talked for a long time. I just want to hear your thoughts.
Well, it was a lot of interest to me, Mark, because, as I mentioned a minute ago, my admissions career began kind of at the dawn of this whole concept. And, the things that we were doing in the 80s in New England were not being done anywhere else. They were kind of really brand new techniques. I knew Jack McGuire. He and others were really starting to come to the fore. But it's funny what I did when I read this article, because I'm much more of a college counselor now than I am a professional admissions person. One of the reasons why I left admissions and decided that my calling was in the secondary college counseling scene was that I didn't want to be part of this. And I remember, after my wonderful stretch of time in a liberal arts college, and very successful, the little college was, because it was ahead of the curve, where when the dean said, I only want you to envision spending a third of your time with students from now on. A third of it should be management, territory management. A third of it should be larger programmatic things that impact more people. And then, so what was the one-on-one work with students? That was visiting the schools. That was the, really getting to know schools and the guidance counselors. And the more I thought about it, I was just like, I get it. I understand. I was enough of a quant that I knew, especially through our test optional research, at Bates that led to the decision in the early 80s to go optional. I had to be able to explain that to the public, and, I did it well. And so I've kind of watched this, and I jotted down what I was aware of kind of as a young professional at that time when I was still in admissions. I remember that one of our first goals was to move this small liberal arts college from a regional to a national attraction. That in the 80s, the population of teenagers in New England was going to drop by half. There was an astonishing cliff there, and it was in the industrialized, states in the Northeast. And you have to remember, this was before the rise of the tech industry. Truthfully, it was before that. But the seeing what was coming meant that colleges and public universities too, and research universities had to move from being regional to national. So getting ahead of the curve on that, expanding the concept of territory management now is commonplace and has been for many years. This was before colleges started hiring out their publications. We're pre-internet now, remember?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And so direct mail was how we did things. And one of the reasons why I got the job that I got at that time was that I had some writing and design experience. So I literally wrote the publications. I worked with a local printer. We picked out the pictures. It was amateur night of marketing publications, but it was all done. Colleges did it all in-house. And I remember when we started interviewing a couple of publications companies, there were a few, especially in the Northeast, that were starting to work with colleges and bring some of the marketing principles from the business side. And marketing was a dirty word at that time. So was recruitment. especially if you were at a so-called respectable private university or college. You didn't want to be seen as stooping to that. But we started looking at non-traditional markets for students. I started one of the first programs of recruiting students of non-traditional age. We formed a consortium called CENTS, C-E-N-T-S, Consortium for the Education of Non-Traditional Students at Traditional Schools. And it was the Ivies and the NESCAC schools for the most part, and a few publics in that group. So that was brand new, kind of in the 80s and the 90s. We started talking about tracking interest. So this was the beginning of seeing interest as a way of predicting yield and yield protection, which has become a science now.
Sure.
And with the talk about the algorithms and EAB and the companies that are doing this professionally, we've talked with we had that great interview with Colorado College on
predicting yield. Yeah.
Yes, with
Matt Bonser.
the concept of the algorithms. What we also saw at this time during this decade mark were the admissions directors being fired.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to say who it was, but I actually remember the first liberal arts college dean in the Northeast at a lovely school, well-known, who lost his job for no reason other than, I think, the institution didn't see him making the transition to a data-driven admission process.
So what are your thoughts, Susan? Do you see this as criticisms of this are just naivete, and at the end of the day, you have to bring in a certain amount of revenue or you can't run your school, and it's just kind of what you have to do? It might be unsavory, but it's what you have to do. Or do you feel like the line's being crossed and there's transgressions all over the place and it's corrupted higher ed? Friends, this concludes the first part of my conversation with Susan on this great Stephen Burd insightful, inflammatory article. Hope you join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Okay, Julia, we have a dad from Texas with a short question, but a good one. I'll play it and let's discuss.
Hey, Mark. I was wondering how colleges determine the travel costs when figuring out their cost of attendance numbers. Thank you.
All right, Julia, you want me to take the lead on this one?
Please.
So the two most common ways I'm aware of that schools use is surveying their students is the biggest one. By the way, I meant to say this. I'm going all the way back to a couple questions ago, Julia, when we were talking about refusals and direct and double deposits. I was going to say, please fill out those surveys. I feel probably really strongly about it because I used to actually design and implement them. I was over surveys for refusals and matriculation, and DNCP did not complete the process. We had surveys for everything to learn more. Those surveys are really, really helpful for schools and planning. Now, I've had some of my families complain this year. Some of them are so long, and I'm like, geez, I get it. But anyway, back to this. I actually sat down with a director of financial aid at a pretty prominent public flagship and asked this exact question. How are you calculating? And actually, to tell you the truth, I didn't only ask it about travel. So let's take a step back. This is a simple way that I look at the expenses that you have to pay for college. You have 4 billable expenses, meaning you pay directly to the bursar's office, to the college, right? Tuition, meals and housing, and student fees. And then you have 4 non-billable expenses, books and supplies, transportation, miscellaneous. And miscellaneous is everything from toiletries to your eating out habits, to your concerts, your entertainment. It's all of that stuff. So this question actually the answer pertains not only to travel. When you look at an aid award, and they have a projection of billable and non-billable fees. Now, what you'll see more often than not, they'll use the term direct and indirect, and not everybody puts everything on there. This is why it's so confusing. Congress has been trying to get legislation passed to have a standard form that everybody has to use, and it's confusing that not everybody puts all this stuff on. Some people only put the direct fees. And once again, different terminology. Some people use direct, indirect. Some people use billable, non-billable, but they're used interchangeably. You have to look for that. Some people put semesters, and some people put the whole year or quarters. So can get very confusing. But the principle of taking a survey does apply to other aspects of the non-billable fees, right? So we're talking transportation, books, supplies, and miscellaneous. So when I sat down with somebody, I set a meeting up because I was questioning how they came up with their numbers. Because to me, they looked a little bit off. By the way, sometimes when I see the numbers look a little bit off, it can be both ways. Sometimes I think that, wow, it doesn't cost that much. And sometimes it's like, it costs more than that. But here's the thing. I encourage everybody to come up with their own individual non-billable expenses when you're calculating costs. So billable, you're not going to really have a choice. Well, there's a little choice on billable because depending on the dorm room you pick, the housing fee could change depending on the meal plan you pick. Although a lot of first years have mandatory meal plans, but sometimes there's flexibility there. So there's a little bit of flexibility there. Tuition, only time that really varies if the number of credit hours that you take, there can be a little bit of variance there. Student fees is pretty standard. So there's not a lot of variation there. But when it comes to the non-billable, I encourage families to sit down and say, how many trips are we going to take? And are they going to be airfare or are we driving? And I encourage parents to include their trips that they might come out to parents' weekends in there. I encourage parents to include hotels and all of that. So the most important thing that I want to say here is create your own numbers based on your lifestyle. Because even if they're doing a survey, let's say, I'll just make up an example of a place. Okay, let's say I have a student that's going to the University of Maryland, College Park. Your transportation costs coming from Philadelphia, Baltimore, or DC are going to be so different versus if you're coming from San Diego, Palo Alto, LA, or Houston. So even when they do surveys, or I should have used different examples. I should have said, like Ghana or India or Bangladesh. I mean, internationals even more, right? So even when they do surveys, the surveys are just going to reflect the overall demographics of their student body. They're not going to reflect your situation. And huge difference in cost if it's international travel or cross-country travel versus something that doesn't involve airfare at all. It might be a train ride or a 30-minute drive. Or you're a commuter student. Likewise, that personal miscellaneous line, what if when you don't eat food in the cafeteria, you have your nice little microwave and fridge, and you're doing your dinners in the microwave or your ramen noodles, and another student is like Ruth Chris and like living large, like their personal miscellaneous fee is completely different than you, or they're going to Taylor Swift and Beyonce concerts, and you're watching Netflix videos. So even that schools use surveys, I encourage you just to create your own and to really sit down and figure out how many trips, how are we getting there, how many times are parents coming, and come up with your own line item. But like I said, I do see almost as many errors on the high side as the low side because they're just working off averages. And I do think they are trying to be fair. This is not a place where I've seen a lot of corruption or shady behavior. I really feel they're trying to be fair. The other method I've seen schools use is just taking a look at where their students are from and just looking up some tables and charts. And one school I talked to, they really did go into the research, though. They start looking up, it wasn't survey-based stuff, but they looked up average flights and did all this and just did a little bit of research looking at where their people were coming from. So, but their projections are not reflecting your cost. It's like someone saying, oh, we're going to Los Angeles. How much is it going to cost? Well, what's the plan? Are you staying with a relative? Is it fine dining? Are you 5-star hoteling it? So those are the two main methods that I've seen. But that's my overall advice, is that you take charge, you take control, you create your own custom college expenses based on knowing your lifestyle, knowing the transportation method you're going to use, and you apply the exact same thing to that miscellaneous category as well. Books, I find, is fairly standard, although there's some variation, because are you going to be doing pre-owned or new? And are you in one of these areas where you have super expensive texts or not? But typically, I find students can get away with around $1,200 on books. And it's, it may be a little variation, a couple $100, but that's a pretty good estimate. Anything you want to add on this one, Julia?
Just would reiterate that you can always, let's say that is part of your aid award, you can always call and ask them how they came to that number. And then since you did your wonderful research, as Mark suggested you do, you'll be able to kind of counter them with what you think it might cost. They might not budge, but it's still worth it to call and ask how the college calculated that cost.
I'm going to go in a slightly different direction with the thought here. So every once in a while, this goes back to something we've talked about before. Every once in a while, a situation occurs where there's scholarship displacement and a school is looking to decrease their grant because you got some outside money.
Yep.
And sometimes you can win that by appealing and saying that your listed price is not my real price. You list $2,400 for transportation, but here are the average costs. You show the times that you need to come and everything. And I've seen people win those. But once again, most of the time when people have that scholarship displacement, they tend to be with the wealthiest schools that are in meaningful need, that have the discretionary money around to do that.
Exactly.
And then there's also something which we haven't talked about in a while. It's called preferential packaging. And it has to do with the fact that colleges can give their best awards to the students that they want the most, like their blue chip prospects. I shared an example once on here on a podcast of a student winning a $9,000 appeal. And a competitor had awarded a student $9,000 more. And it was a school that did need-based only, not merit-based appeals. Merit-based, they can just say, we match. And so they said, well, we need to go look into the numbers and see if there's some additional expenses that you had. And the mom had gone through a divorce, and she had provide documentation of all those expenses. And the school added that to her real cost and granted the $9,000. Now, I don't think they would have done that for everybody.
Yep.
This was a superstar they really wanted, and that's where sometimes preferential packaging can come into play. So anyway, I'm doing it again where I take one question, I go off on another direction.
Yeah. Well, there's so much nuance there. There's a lot of potential ways to deal with that.
Yeah, and there's a college counselor from Atlanta, and she wrote in and she said, what I really like about your podcast is that you guys talk about the nuance. That was one of the nice things that, that's been said. We try, it's hard because there's so much nuance. There's nuance on top of nuance. And if you nuance all day, it'll sound like you don't believe in anything.
No, I know. And there's new nuance.
Yes, there's new nuance. That's why we have jobs that are never boring. There's always something changing.
Totally.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that was helpful for Dad from Texas. Julie and I casually use the term scholarship displacement. We didn't bother defining scholarship displacement because we had already recorded a question from a listener on scholarship displacement. But it dawned on me afterward that that session hasn't run yet. It hasn't aired. So let me define scholarship displacement. Scholarship displacement refers to when a student wins an outside scholarship from a corporation or a church or place of worship, a civic organization, a foundation, a philanthropist, and the college requires you to share this outside award with them. And then when the college gets the award, they reduce your gift aid, or they displace the scholarship, hence the origin of the term. Now, gift aid is a financial aid term that refers to free money that does not have to be repaid, grants and scholarships. It's the other component of financial aid. Self-help is the other part, which would be loans and work study. Now, Julie and I will be discussing this soon on the podcast because the listener sent in a question to us, and we've already recorded our answer on scholarship displacement. I also wanted you to know that after Julie and I recorded this, I reached out to a financial aid director that I keep in regular communication with. I worked with his student, and I sent him a text, and I just asked him, how do you guys calculate your travel awards that you use in your cost of attendance data? And so I'm going to read to you what this financial aid director said. There's some good information here. He says, good question about travel. NASFA has a good monograph on building the cost of attendance. Now, NASFA is the National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators. We've referred to it a few times on the podcast, but we'll come back with you with a whole recommended resource in the not too distant future on NASFA. He goes on to say, we review the cost of attendance each year, but we don't have to do a full overhaul each year. What we do is we look at the mileage, and he lists the town that his school is in. I just don't want to out him because I didn't ask for permission to share his name. So we list the mileage from our city for the states that are relatively close. And then we look at airfare from states that are further away. We use the state capitals to measure the distance. And for the airport from that state capital, we use that for round-trip air tickets. So there you go. There's another perspective from a financial aid director letting you know how they calculate the travel award that shows up in their cost of attendance figures.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, in part 3 of 4 of how admission offices evaluate homeschooled applicants, we're talking about advice for homeschoolers when it comes to 5 critical areas: the transcript, the counselor letter, the school profile, activities lists, and the curriculum guide. Liam talks about the value of the one-page overview document. Liam talks about a missed opportunity that he encounters rather frequently with some homeschooled students. We answer the question, should the parent write the counselor letter? We also answer the question, should the parent write the teacher letter? So let's talk about 3 different components of an application, and I'd love to get some advice from all of you on this. One is the transcript, how to present a transcript. Another is the homeschool profile, and another is the counselor letter. So, when I think about this interview, I think this appeals to 2 groups of people. It's going to definitely appeal to homeschool students and homeschool parents who want to know they're doing everything possibly to give their child the best opportunity. And then we also have just very intellectually curious audience that just wants to learn things about, education. So, but particularly for those who are homeschooling, what advice do you have on either the counselor letter, homeschool profile, or the transcript?
Oh, that's a big question. So, how much time do we have in this interview? So, I'll give a stab at this, and I am sure both Michele and Liam will have lots to add to that. So, I would actually, first of all, say, often, Mark, there are 4 counselor documents because course descriptions are typically in there for homeschoolers, sometimes as a backing part of the transcript and sometimes as an entirely separate document. So, so many homeschoolers I know have even considered quitting homeschooling simply because they're scared to create a transcript. They're intimidated by that. They don't know how to do it. They feel like it's too much. And that, it's a one-page document of your record. So make it clear, make it readable, make sure it says official high school transcript, because that's what makes it official. Sign your document, list your classes. You do have to put some grades down in most cases. I'm thrilled that Liam is adept at narrative transcript interpretation. Not all places are. So usually Michele and I would probably each suggest people do provide grades, and we give them advice on how to arrive at those grades. But clear, concise, and compelling are the keys to your counselor documents. I thought it was interesting when we started writing the book together, Michele and I, because we got to the transcript chapter, and I won't tell on either one of us, but one of us had a certain idea that, I think colleges really like subject formatted transcripts. And the other one of us was like, you know what? I think colleges really like transcripts formatted by year. And eventually what we came to is, you know what? It probably doesn't matter as long as it is clear and there's a reason you chose that particular format for your student. So in our book, our example is a subject formatted transcript, simply because we felt like that is a little bit less common to find a million examples of online. So that's what we put in our book. But I think a successful transcript can be organized either way. What is more important, or as important, I would say, are those course descriptions. And I think a common misconception, and here I'm going to try to do a favor for Liam. Sometimes parents feel that those need to be exhaustive course descriptions, and that, very frankly, is just exhausting to your admission reps. So please don't do that. There's very few things that I say please don't about. But if you have a 45-page course description packet that you're about to send out the door, rethink that. Rethink that. So it needs to be concise. So we're talking maybe a paragraph per class at the most. But certainly describe how your student learned, what materials you used. I have found that colleges and institutions lately really want to know, was this an in-person class? Was this an online class? Was it a one-on-one situation? Was it a group situation? So talking about the frequency and modality of the course matters. And then something I see in my practice quite a bit is homeschoolers sometimes forget to tell how they arrived at their grade. What was their evaluation criteria? Did you value discussion? Did you value group projects? Were there tests and quizzes? And, sort of what percentage, ballpark, went into each element making up the grade. So that, I think, are key components for transcript and course description. And then school profile and counselor letter is really your opportunity to provide context and nuance. Liam spoke about that so much. And plenty of colleges employ landscape that they use to get a sense of their traditionally schooled applicants. Well, landscape only goes so far with a homeschooled applicant. Landscape doesn't capture what your homeschool opportunities were in your community. So in your profile, it's good to give a sense of that. If you're a secular homeschooler and you were in part of a secular homeschooling group and that was 500 members strong in your greater community, you need to explain that. I also think parents need to not assume that admission readers are very familiar with individual homeschool providers. They may know a lot of them, but it is a almost infinite landscape. So in that homeschool profile, give a sense of your educational provider, not just the class, but what was this Pennsylvania homeschoolers that you took a class through? Who are they? What are they? Give a couple lines about that. And also just explain any limitations you had, whether that's a lack of AP seats. Sometimes families have significant health challenges. Whatever limitations or nuances are, your homeschool profile and your counselor letter are places where you can explain those and fill in any gaps from the student side of the application. So that was a lot, and I'm sure Michele and Liam have much to add.
Well, Liam, before you jump in, I want to say one thing about that counselor letter. writing course descriptions and transcript and all that, it's a lot of work, but you can do that. And it's kind of not exactly cut and dried, but it's pretty factual. And the school profile, the same thing. And then you get to the counselor letter. This is the first time that you are writing to communicate typically about your child as an adult, a young adult going off into the world. This is a rite of passage for a lot of parents. And they start writing, I recommend my child for this reason. I can't tell you how many start with when my child was 4, 5, 6, whatever age, right? And that can be a wonderful story. And I encourage parents, go ahead and sit down and write out your story of homeschooling and then put that aside. And now we're going to write a counselor rec. Save that because that is so valuable and so meaningful to your family. But a counselor rec is something different. I look at it, and I'll love to hear what Liam's going to say, as a frequently asked questions. When somebody in the admissions office looks at your kid's transcript and their course descriptions and their kid's application, what questions are they going to have? Are they going to wonder, why did this kid do 4 years of public speaking? Why did this kid have this break or take that opportunity? What strengths can you show? What questions can you answer in that counselor rec? Maybe you have a quote from a mentor, because that gives some external validation again, right? My kid worked with this person and they said, quote, bam, right? It's not all, doesn't have to only be written by the parent, but concise, clear, and compelling. Absolutely. Keep it under 2 pages.
And I think everything you both said, I love, and it's no surprise that you talk about this all day and write about it. You know what you're talking about, but I'm really in favor of giving students and families flexibility in the application process, right? And so to me, it's all about giving me a roadmap and giving me the information I have to have up front, and then allowing me to sort of make my way into the additional information if I have the time, if I'm trying to answer a question. So with both the course descriptions and the counselor letter, to me, even if you want to include, here's the 5-page story about where we started at 4 years old, great. That comes after the counselor rec, right? and I might read it, and it might be really helpful. It might give me a great sense of philosophically where you're coming from. If that's gonna, if I identify that that's gonna help me make a recommendation on this application. But if the core part of the counselor recommendation is 4.5 pages in, there's a good chance I might miss it, right? So you're going to be doing your student a disservice by burying that. Same thing, Holly, I really appreciate just the clarity that a transcript and course descriptions are 2 different things. I think if we start with that, we're already like, your transcript is going to be awesome because you're creating a transcript that's separate from course descriptions. And we do see the 30-page course description document where the grades are in there with each course, but there's no summary. And so for me to then try to figure out, has the student done 3 years of foreign language? Have they done 3 lab sciences? That's a 20-minute process to try to answer those questions. So if I can start with a 1-page document that summarizes the education, and I can get a quick glance, these are their strengths, these are maybe the subjects they haven't explored as much, then I start to have questions. Then I say, well, I'm a little confused why they did this or why they did that. And then I can go in the deeper resources digging for the answer I need, instead of flipping through all those 30 pages trying to get the summary. So to me, that's the core of it, is figure out the information we actually absolutely have to have, give that to us on 1 page, and then share all of the fabulous things that you have and help us, give us a roadmap for how to go in there and use them. But just make sure that's not the core. And I also just want to echo what Michele said about the counselor recommendation, which is just fundamentally, it's going to be a challenge for us to take your word that your student is the most brilliant applicant we've gotten this year. It doesn't mean you're wrong, but it's going to be challenging for us to take that without a little bit of external validation. But that doesn't mean that it can't be an incredibly valuable recommendation. And even, in fact, counselor recommendations coming from traditional schools, it is not the counselor's job primarily to recommend how, sort of brilliant a classroom the student is. That's where the teacher recommendations come in. It is, precisely as Michele said, the counselor's job to provide context for the application. What has the student chosen to do while they're in school? What are the opportunities they had? How did they take advantage of those opportunities? what are maybe some things you might expect to see that you're not seeing and why? Like, maybe not being able to take AP exams, right? That is what the counselor rec is for writ large, not just in the homeschool circumstances. So you're doing, exactly what the recommendation is supposed to be doing.
Could I linger on transcripts for just a moment? Because I think this has been just very valuable for homeschool parents to begin wrapping their mind around their counselor documents. One question that maybe gets lost, but I know is a question in the homeschool community, is sometimes parents are very confused about whether something should be put on the transcript as a class or whether it should be counted as an extracurricular. We get this question all the time, and it is not a question that traditionally schooled students typically have to wrestle with, because the division between class and something outside of class is super clear in private or public schools. It is often muddled in homeschool situations. So just a word of advice, because I know there are homeschool parents listening to this who are wondering this same thing. Sometimes I have seen the tendency be for a homeschool parent to want to give credit to everything on that transcript. And usually when I see that, it is because the parent has not yet looked at the entirety of the Common App and does not understand how the different parts of the Common App play and interact with one another. So it makes me sad when I see people who have done this wonderful education-rich experience that they want to put as a credit, which by my way of looking at the transcript, sometimes is going to get lost in a sea of credits. And I try to guide them often that this would really shine brightest as an extracurricular. Now, that's not always the case, but I would say it's often the case that I see parents trying to give credit for every educational thing their kid has done. And I understand that impulse. However, there is an activity section and there's only 10 items on it. And boy, some of those things can really sparkle over on the activity list. Or you can also separate out. So sometimes you have a very tightly knit ball of educational experience, and some of it gets shunted over toward activity list, and some of it remains in a class format. And Michele, you probably have more thoughts on this because I know you are an expert when it comes to delight-driven learning that tends to produce a lot of those situations where it's very intertwined.
Absolutely. We followed unschooling or child-led learning practices in my home and with many of the students I work with. Now, just because it's not is unschooling or is child-led doesn't mean that it wasn't a community college class. A kid can say, I want to learn more about this and do something in a very structured manner, but it can also mean it's very intertwined. And one example I use with parents is, say, orchestra. You can have a school orchestra or band. If it happens during the school day and the school gives credit, then it's a credited thing. If it happens after school, then it's an extracurricular. But in the homeschool world, you have the choice. It's a completely legitimate choice of whether you put this on the transcript or if you put it as an extracurricular. But the activities list has a different purpose. It shows what the student does outside of school, what they choose to do, because a typical school student has requirements they have to meet. Well, a lot of us, our children develop the requirements with us for their homeschool, understanding what a college is expecting to see of those 4 years of math and science, etc. So let what your student does by choice shine on that activity list.
Liam, what are other either requirements that some schools may have, you may not have Beloit, but you're in touch with other schools as well, or recommendations for homeschool students? What are another way of putting it, what are the missed opportunities, either because somebody didn't provide this additional thing? I'll leave it at that. Requirements or recommendations that you see either from your school or other homeschool students that other schools enact.
Sure. I think we've covered just about all of the requirements that a student would run into. Testing requirements is right near the top of the list. All of those documents that typically a school counselor would put together that the parent is responsible for, and there are more than one. Right? I think a lot of families doing this without guidance know they have to put together a transcript, but don't really realize that there are other steps there. There are, of course, schools that will require or encourage interviews. There are, if you're doing performing arts, for instance, an audition might be part of it, but none of those are homeschool specific, right? Those are just different types of application processes. In terms of recommendations or missed opportunities, I think it was Holly who said it earlier. I get disappointed when homeschoolers don't take advantage of the opportunity the application affords to sell how amazing their experience has been. The application was designed to capture the experiences of a traditionally schooled student. And even many of those students, I don't think it does a fabulous job of capturing everything that they've done, but it was designed in response to that structure, right? And so just because we don't believe that homeschoolers should be required to do a bunch of extra things doesn't mean that fulfilling the bare minimum requirements of the application is going to create a really strong homeschool application. My experience with homeschoolers generally has been that they are super talented, curious, very well socialized against that stereotype, right? Really comfortable interacting with students from students and parents, faculty, et cetera, folks from all different backgrounds, really motivated intrinsically, and generally make really, really great college students. And that is not going to come across automatically through one transcript and one essay. And so there's not one right thing that every homeschooler should be doing in their application, but I think that they should really be sitting down as a student and as a homeschooled family and saying, what has made my education really unique, compelling? What do I bring uniquely to the table that's going to make colleges really excited? And how can I make sure they see that? There are lots of opportunities in the application to put sort of your own spin on it, put your own personality into it. What you write your essay about is, of course, important. There's the additional information section next to the essay where the student can share a lot about their homeschool experience in addition to what the parent has shared. There is the activities section. There are, who you choose to do recommendations. And then there are always, possibilities in terms of interviews and other correspondence with the college. To me, homeschoolers are the poster child for the students who should be taking advantage of all of those opportunities in order to capture how unique and interesting their experience has been. And so when a homeschool application comes in that looks just like an application of a schooled student, and I don't get any sense for, why did they make this choice? How have they taken advantage of it? What are their unique experiences? What have those experiences been? I just have a list of courses and grades. And, sometimes those students get admitted. Sometimes it's pretty clear that they're academically ready to succeed in college, but I feel really confident that I haven't gotten as deep a sense of what they bring to the table as I could have.
Back to the counselor letter. Do you feel, what are there times when you feel like the parent shouldn't do the counselor letter? Like there's another person that can do that letter. The parent's not the only one involved in educating, because obviously there's different homeschool models, right? There's times when there's other people involved in the process. I've seen that on some websites where they advise that when possible. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, the Common App has one counselor that the student invites, and that person is the one who uploads the transcript and writes the school profile and the course descriptions, etc. That's the parent. That's the one who took official responsibility from the state for educating this child. Now, that doesn't mean that they can't have quotes from somebody else. And it doesn't mean that they provided all the education. I have degrees in math and computer science, and I did not teach my students as high schoolers any math or computer science because that's not how they wanted it. I needed to be mom in those realms. So I didn't write their recommendations in those sections. But the parent is the one who took the responsibility to oversee this education and is the one who is responsible for putting up those documents. Absolutely, I would not want a parent to write the primary teacher recommendations. It's much better from somebody else. But the counselor recommendation, as done by the Common App, is uploaded by the same person who uploads the others and is supposed to sign it as their work. So yes, I put quotes from other people, but it's supposed to be my work. I'm going to be the one signing it as the parent.
And I'm glad you brought up the teacher rec because we haven't talked about that yet. And that's important. That's an obviously, important piece of information that's a requirement from the school that's another source of information for the school to get a perspective, oftentimes from somebody else. But Holly, you wanted to add something?
Well, I was maybe even going to take that maybe even one step further than Michele and say that, there's, I don't know, maybe a couple dozen educational consultant specialists across the country who have homeschooling as a specialization. And Michele and I know, I think all of them, or just about all of them. And I would be very surprised if I saw a recommendation on any of their sites to have someone other than the parent write the counselor letter. Seek out a Liam at a college who is reading these all the time, or one of us who works with homeschool families day in, day out, and came from the community ourselves. And the other thing I'd probably point out is, we also know that close to 80% of the homeschooling is done by the mother in the family, to the extent, who the overseer of the homeschooling. She's not necessarily teaching every class, but most of the time, this is a mom. And many of the times, that mom has put her career on hold or pause to turn to the career of home educating. It is a noble career. It's a worthwhile career. And while a counselor letter may not be evaluative in a homeschool setting, it is informative. And I would just hesitate to take the voice away from the professional who's been doing that education for 12 or 13 years. And that is the homeschool parent, and most often the homeschool mom.
Do you feel we've covered tips for writing that counselor letter? Is there anything else you want to share that we haven't touched on there? Because this is important. And I think it's also a source of stress.
The first thing is I just wanted to make a note. We've been talking about these letters of recommendation as though there is one standard approach in terms of what's required and what a college application should look like. And that has been sort of historically a recommendation from the counselor, and then often 2 letters of recommendation from teachers, though that varies a little bit. Over the past, for many years, but particularly over the past couple of years, those requirements have become more and more varied at different schools. So there are schools that do want a teacher recommendation, but don't want a counselor recommendation. There are schools that want a counselor recommendation, but no teacher recommendation. There are schools that will not read any of that. It's really enlightening for me. There's a group of folks who are regional in the New England area who travel together from really, really different schools. And we do case studies on, what would happen with this type of applicant versus that applicant, to have colleagues say, well, the counselor, recommendation explained all of this, so you made this decision, but I don't even see that in our system. It doesn't come to us. We get what the student says, and we get a transcript, period. So it's just worth understanding that, for these families that unfortunately you're going to have to do research for all the colleges you're thinking about applying to and look at what they ask for. But I think if you see a college that says, we don't want a recommendation from a parent, which I think can happen, very likely that they're talking about a teacher recommendation. Right. And that is a really different thing, not the counselor recommendation. They may not want a counselor recommendation, period. But usually they're saying we don't want a rec from a parent. They're talking about the teacher recommendation. We don't always use the clearest language around that. If it's a college that only asks for one letter at all, they're using their own language.
Friends, this concludes part 3 of our interview on homeschooled applicants in the college admission process. Hope you join us next week for the final part.
And now it's time for our college spotlight of the week.
Friends, Kev and I were just having a great conversation on LSE, and I didn't want to stop it because I thought it was really good. And he was just bringing the punch, coming with content. So I'm going to run this over 3 weeks. And what you're going to hear is the first of 3. And next week we'll have part 2. And the final week we'll have the final part. Listen and enjoy. Friends, Kevin Newton is back. And he's here talking about a very popular school, the London School of Economics, also known as LSE. How are you, Kev?
Doing great, Mark. How are you doing?
Good. Do you know what? Just take it away. Take it where you want to go.
Right. So, there are a lot of reasons to love LSE. There are also a lot of reasons to perhaps not be so fond of LSE.
Love both sides.
It's officially the London School of Economics and Political Science. And An interesting fact about it, back when the United Nations was founded, there were more nationalities represented at LSE than there were in the UN. And that stayed the case for quite some years. So if you're looking for a place that is really plugged into the business and economics and political policy worlds, and with all due respect to the New Yorkers who may be listening, in the absolute coolest city in the world, and that has nothing but the absolute highest of academic standards, LSE is it. That all said, it is a place that, does identify itself very much with big banks, big government, also small government, which is just a big, flag for some people. But it's, that said, the academic prowess of anyone who is associated to the university, I think it's hard to beat.
So I got a quick question for you. So, Dave, one of our co-hosts, my lifetime friend, his daughter finished up at Yale with a 3.94 GPA, and she's headed there for a master's in political science in the fall. And she picked it. She got in Cambridge, Oxford. She got in all those places, but she picked LSE over all those schools. Is that surprising to you?
Not at all. There's a joke among those of us who went to different parts of the University of London, which LSE is part of the University of London. It's slowly looking like it may want to eventually make its exit, but it's not there yet, is that these are the places where people go to really specialize. These are the places where people go, once you've gotten a degree from someplace like Oxford or Cambridge or someplace like that this is where you go to really specialize. Now, that said, it's an amazing place to get an undergrad degree, but I have actually one of my fraternity brothers, we graduated from William and Mary at the same time. He went to LSE, I went to SOAS, and it has served him incredibly well. I won't dox him too much, but in the larger city he's in, he is very plugged into the political and business scene, and in no small part it's because he did politics at LSE. I think that served as a great launching pad for him.
Yeah, it feels like it's more one of the more household names in the U.S.
Absolutely. And I think, when I think of LSE, and, Mark, this, I'm a huge West Wing fan. I mean, my dogs are named Fitz and Leo.
Oh. Need any more proof, anybody? There it is.
And President Bartlett, the fictional character, went for his master's and PhD at LSE. So it definitely takes this interesting place in the American mindset. And something I want to make sure we talk about, although we'll get there eventually, is the general course, which it's a little outside my wheelhouse because it's a study abroad opportunity for people who are getting their degrees elsewhere outside of the UK. But it's one of those study abroad opportunities that I think is very unique. And I just want to make sure we mention it at some point.
So let's talk about undergrad, because that's what most of our listeners will be interested in. I mean, we have 31% of our listeners have a kid in college. So some of them may have some thoughts on graduate school and things like that. But the majority of them are high school parents thinking about undergrad. Talk to us a little bit about the admission process.
So part of the flip side of LSE being so good at everything they do is that it is tough. I've had students get into Oxford and Cambridge who did not get into LSE. So it's very dependent on AP exams. They don't even take into account your ACT or SAT. They want straight 5s on your AP exams, and they want you to come very much prepared for what you want to study. So if you're looking to study economics or business, you need to have Calc BC as a 5. If you're looking at studying politics or philosophy, you need to have some of those history classes or history exams, and preferably American politics or comparative politics at a 5.
So let's go back to the SAT, ACT. Like, is it literally a non-factor, or it's not really it's a positive factor, but it's not a game changer?
They won't even look at it.
Wow. So it's really more of a non-factor.
Right. They honestly, this is not confirmed from anyone at LSE, but I get the idea that whereas most other universities in the UK use the ACT or SAT as a
Sure.
stand-in for the GCSEs, the exams you take when you're around 15 or 16 to prove that you can read and write and do math.
Right.
LSE seems to take the mindset of you wouldn't be applying here if you weren't capable. So, and again, their cutoffs on everything else are so crazy. It's again, they're.
And is it like a definite 5, like 4's not welcome?
I think on your fifth or sixth exam, you can get a 4 depending on the subject area.
So if you can post 4 5s, maybe you can have a 4 kind of thing. So I have a question for you. I'm assuming not all APs are seen as equal.
Correct.
Which ones are they respecting, and are there any that you find they're really not respecting that much?
So back about 20 years ago, UCAS have issued this official guidance on different types of AP exams, and most places have phased it out by now. It was Group A versus Group B, but it's still a pretty good structure. We've probably talked about it before.
No, we haven't. I think this will be of great interest to our listeners.
Okay.
Even those in a U.S. context will still be curious about this. So yeah, why don't you talk about that, Group A, Group B? Like what APs are in Group A versus Group B?
So Group A APs are those that, the easy way to keep track of it, are those that usually award a full years of college credit. So biology, chemistry, physics, because Physics C and Physics are both parts of Physics C here, are both parts of, I think it's Physics 1 and Physics 2 now. Any language or literature class, be it an English or a foreign language, Calc AB or Calc BC.
Mm-hmm.
And
what about world history?
World history. I know world history is the weird one there because it only typically does a semester, but they still really like it. World history, European history, and American history. The other APs, things like computer science or art history or economics or
human geography,
statistics, geography, are Group Bs. That those traditionally only
environmental science too, probably.
Yeah. So a place like LSE wants, they don't call it that anymore, but those Group A subjects, the full year ones. Now, obviously, if you're applying for economics, you should probably come with an AP in economics, but they're going to want both macro and micro. That said, if your school doesn't offer it, there's always that spot on the UCAS application where the person writing your letter of recommendation can say, that Mark took every class that he could get his hands on. And even though they don't honor dual enrollment classes, if you go out and do a dual enrollment class, then take the AP, that will impress them.
So let's talk about this more, because I'll tell you what oftentimes you'll hear in a U.S. context. It came up when we had Karen Christoph on it from VP and Dean of Admissions at Colorado College for a Q&A with our listeners, and we got into this with APs. And you'll hear it a lot of times. The challenge with APs is we don't see anything you took senior year. You're getting that in July. So, it puts a certain amount of more emphasis on the grade in the class over here, because there's literally no access to anything 12th grade before decisions have to be made. So how does that play a role in for an LSE, knowing as for an American, they're not even seeing AP scores until July, which is after the admission cycle. You have to take them all by 10th and 11th in order to prove yourself?
No. So you want to have a good critical mass going in,
but
they'll do the conditional acceptances.
Okay.
Where your offer is conditional on you getting 5s on these AP classes.
Then again, I should know that because that happened with somebody you and I worked together, with last year that ended up at Oxford, but they needed to get a 5, it was a conditional accept if they could land a 5, and I should have known that. Yep.
No, it's fine. That person actually took it a lot better than most other students. Typically when they get
that's
that
some stress.
When they get that call or that email saying, they have to get a 5, I've had one kid, he's finishing up. This is his last year at Cambridge. And he just, he texted me the morning he got his acceptance and was like, I don't get to get senioritis because of you. I don't know how to feel about that.
Not because of you. It's because you want to go to Cambridge.
Oh, it was all because of me.
Hey, we'll be bad cop if that's what we need to be to help kids get where they're trying to go.
I'll take that one. I'll take that, but no, it would just be a conditional acceptance.
Sure.
So for some students, that's something they can just take in stride. For other students, it's a cause of stress. And that is something, we factor in.
Sure. And I'm assuming, as you said before, you need to nail that AP in the subject that you're interested in. You tell me you want chemistry. I need to see that. You tell me.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, if there are some exceptions. Like if you were going to go in and study, you had an obsession with East Asian studies. Not a lot of places are going to expect you to show up with the AP Chinese test because not a lot of schools offer it here in the U.S.
Sure.
Also, not a lot of sixth forms and other secondary schools in the U.K. teach Chinese to any appreciable levels. They just teach that from the drop.
All right, Kev, sixth forms, man. You went inside baseball with the sixth forms language. Break it down, man. This is American audience.
Last 2 years of high school when you take your A-level exams in the UK. So just junior and senior year, essentially.
Sure. So question for you. You've told me that we're not even looking at ACT, SAT. It's all about the AP. What role are grades and the transcript playing?
Think of it as the replacement for the baseline. So for a lot of courses, LSE will specify the GPA at typically around a 3.7, 3.8, somewhere in there on a 4.0. And it serves to make sure that you are intelligent and well-rounded. But let's face it, Algebra 2 has a bad habit of sneaking up on all of us, and it accepts that.
So let's talk about this, because if you look at the most selective U.S. schools, they're not only going to tell you they do holistic admissions, they generally do what I call full-blown holistic admissions, right? Because everybody likes to say they do holistic admissions. I mean, who wants to tell a kid they're a number, at least over here in the U.S.? But we know that means very different things at different schools. But at your most selective schools, they really are looking at all kinds of factors, whether it's the income and education of your parents, studying in detail the school you're coming from, looking in detail at the grading systems and that kind of thing. To what degree does a school like LSE get into looking at something like a school profile and looking at grade distribution? I mean, on this same episode, Susan and I were talking about for the big number, which I did. I talked about a school, a student I'm working with, where 81% of students have an A- or higher, and 93% have a B+ or higher. And that's all on the school profile. So a school can literally look at a student's grades and put them in context and say, okay, you have a B+. Guess what? You're like 19 of 20 kids at that school with a B+ or higher. So do they get into that type of contextual read of a transcript?
Not as much, because they fall back on the fact that they have an absolute requirement for the APs.
All right. I had a feeling you were going to say that. So like the bottom line is the AP it's
Right.
more like the grades we have the grades high enough to make sure you're not a slacker.
Right.
So we say like, okay, 3.75, 3.8-ish, that puts you in the game.
You hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
LSE is not looking for the brilliant student who shows up 3 days a year, takes his or her 3 AP exams and gets 5s, but then doesn't show up the rest of the time. They want strong, consistent performance, but especially when it's time to take the exam.
So let's talk about what else is involved in the evaluation. Recommendations at all? Writing at all? Extracurriculars at all? Talk about those three things and tell me what role, if any, writing recommendations. Over here, we've got counselor recs, we've got teacher recs, we might even have another rec, and then there's certainly a lot of writing in the application, and extracurriculars are considered. So do any of those things play a role in it all?
You get one recommendation from a teacher.
Okay.
It can come from a counselor if the counselor wants to piece together bits and pieces from the teacher. It's, as of last year, it's now a 3-part recommendation, where one part is a general introduction to the school. Another part is any special difficulties the students faced. And the third part is the students' applicability towards the course. As for writing, LSE does not have a supplement. You have the same personal statement you're submitting everywhere else, but LSE is a prickler on personal statements.
Friends, this concludes the first part of Kevin Newton breaking down the London School of Economics. We hope you join us next week for part 2 of 3. Friends, on Monday's episode, we'll take a speak pipe question from a listener that's come in that Lisa and I will discuss, and we already recorded, actually. You'll hear that. And then we have a brand new interview. It's from a friend of mine. I've known him for 22 or 23 years. He's been in education and in college placement and boarding school placement for 45 years. He started a couple different community-based organizations, one back in 1980, and then he started another one about a decade ago called Go to College New York City. It's my friend John Hoffman. And we were just having a conversation recently about so many things, including his daughter, who just graduated from high school, and her experience. And I'm like, John, I need you to come on the podcast and bequeath that wisdom to our listeners. So you'll be hearing from John Hoffman from New York City for the next 3 weeks. And friends, remember, college is not a prize to be won. It is a match to be made. Block out the noise and run your own race and play the long game. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stelianos Dimitriou. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.